is Beverley, who is an assistant professor at State University of New York, Stony Brook. And coming to his academic qualifications, he has pursued his MA from University of Texas and has completed his PhD from Harvard University. Sir has been a visiting lecturer at Harvard University and also a tutor of history in Harvard University. And now sir is currently assisting in as an assistant professor in State University of New York, Stony Brook. So I would like to invite sir for the main session. And sir has also authored one book which we have conducted collective reading sessions, and the one book which we are going to present here. The book name is, as you all know, we have been reading and understanding that book from 2 to 3 weeks. So the book name is Hyderabad, British India and the World, which is considering one century, that is 1850 to 1950. Sir has also been running 3 book current projects. There are 3 different books whom the sir has been working upon right now. So I would like to invite sir to start the session. Over to you, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, sorry, I was stuck behind the mute lock there, but finally I've been unmuted. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry for the momentary delay there. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to all of you for being here to engage and discuss this work. Thank you, Junaid Saab, for the introduction, and many thanks to Advocate Syed Ghiyasuddin for inviting me to this event, and to Anuradha Reddy of INTAC, who is here in a capacity as, I believe, discussant and moderator for some of the conversations later. I'm very, very keen to be part of this discussion with all of you. In any case, this book is now over 6 years old and is on the Asif Jahi period in Hyderabad and its legacy. And the fact that the book is now a few years old already, and there is so much interest to continue to discuss these topics, suggests to me that in some ways, past histories and dynamics, with all their limitations and the different kinds of promise and possibilities they offer, really remain important in places such as India for reimagining and reflecting on contemporary political practice. And it's in some ways extremely encouraging and promising for me to see this interest. But also I have to say, and I want to talk more about this with all of you, that I have some concerns and fear that this turn and interest in history is in some ways also a sign of the desperation of our current times and the deep need that people in India and Hyderabad in particular have to rethink historical pasts and possible futures in an era that's really characterized by a rising tyranny and limitation on speech and ability to think about these kinds of structures. So in that spirit, I want to mention I've already in contact with Advocate Ghiyasuddin, been fortunate enough to receive a list of several probing questions generated by the group. I'm going to address in some ways some of them here, but I'm also really quite keen and interested to hear what is about the current and very local concerns that are shaping the interests and inquiries that provoke these questions and the interest in the work as a whole, about concepts that I talk about, such as progress, Muslimness, publicity and textual production and publication, social welfare policies from the Asif Jahi period, community solidarities that emerged then, political administration, and urban change. So I would really encourage everybody when we get to the question and answer portion of today's meeting to really take the time to sort of frame your questions within some of the things that you're thinking about outside of the Asif Jahi period and the coverage of the book itself, So we can all sort of reflect together on the ways that the histories my book traces are relevant for contemporary happenings in Hyderabad, India, South Asia, and the world more broadly. And I'll start by just making one very, very simple point, which I think may be clear to many of us, but is one of the points that I think I sought to make in the book and that I still view as extremely important. And that's simply that the Asif Jahi period, despite the fact that it's now 70 plus years past, remains important to the present of Hyderabad and India. This is obviously something that I think is quite obvious to members of this club and very apparent. Also, I think it's worth saying that being as how many of you are linked to Osmania University, which itself is a key institution of Asif Jahi Hyderabad, and one which has continued to be shaped by alliances and projects current in the state for inclusion and empowerment of many communities, Muslims, caste Hindus, Dalits, Adivasis, and others, and infused by global connections and migrations and awareness of various different kinds of global political movements. So I think that the life of the Asif Jahi period and its institutions and some of the ethics embodied within them and some very specific histories are very useful to think and talk about for understanding and imagining other possible political presence in India and well beyond. And I think it's also worth noting that the movement, which was very much underfoot at the time when I was researching and writing this book and has now come in various ways into fruition for the realization of Telangana as a provincial state based on the Telugu districts of the former Asif Jahi state, in that sense, re-inscribing on the map the political boundaries of what previously had been the Asif Jahi Hyderabad state, shows very well how some of these questions still remain in play and in conversation. And we see in the making of Telangana divergent histories, political cultures, social orders of British India and former non-British India coming together and being reassessed and reconsidered in terms of how to best align the present with the implications of these histories. I also think the creation of Telangana and consideration of that in light of the Asif Jahi history that my book looks at may help in some ways to underscore and think about the larger promises of provincial reorganization and the limitations that might have occurred in its realization and the possibilities that might continue to be striven for. I also want to, in this talk about the book and in our conversation, think about the ways that the workings of political sovereignty have really radically changed from the Asif Jahi period to the present. So what I'm going to do is summarize some of the major arguments in the book, in the 2016 book published in the UK in 2015 and in a South Asia edition in 2016, about Hyderabad under Asif Jahi rule from 1850 through 1948 and afterwards. And I'll provide some examples as well. I'd also like to take a little bit of time to talk about legacies and continuing resonances of the Asif Jahi state after integration into India in 1948 and up into the present. So essentially, the core argument of the book is that it's critical to rethink princely states and so-called indirect rule as historical and analytical concepts. So princely state, as well as indirect rule, are both terms that are coined by the British colonial empire as ways of describing existing forms of sovereignty in South Asia and subordinating them within a larger political system. And indirect rule in particular, the term that is still very often used to describe the Asif Jahi state, is often the source of a lot of confusion because many scholars, as well as British officials, used indirect rule to apply not only to areas such as Hyderabad, Mysore, Kashmir, which had independent self-functioning governance that needed to enter into relations with the colonial state, but are also used to describe places that were under direct British rule, but were in which social institutions were taken up by British officials as a way for ruling. So I guess basically what I'm saying is we need to sort of get rid of terms like indirect rule, because they actually reflect, first of all, colonial visions for how politics should have worked and not necessarily the legal reality. But also they blur the boundaries between places such as Hyderabad, which with its own independent legislature and government and so forth, and places within British Indian presidencies and other holdings where, for example, caste or zamindari were used as institutions of rule. Those are other kind of institutions that are for which indirect rule is used to describe. So I think that this term is misleading for talking about autonomous states like Asaf Jahi Hyderabad. I also think the term princely state is somewhat misleading, and it makes it in some ways hard for us to understand the kinds of political processes in places like Hyderabad. The term suggests that rulers, nizams in this case, were not kings or queens or full-fledged royals, but mere princes who in some way had not realized yet their political sovereignty, which in fact is not the case in practice, even as these states have less power in a global sense than something like the British Crown or other sort of full-fledged dominant European and imperial powers. So these are some of the things that I tried to really establish in the book. Empire is not a homogeneous political space. There are a lot of different parts and spaces that are under different kinds of regimes of control. I think that things substantially change with decolonization, but nevertheless, places in empire or related to empire, such as Hyderabad, which had autonomy and their own kinds of legal and political dispensations, continue to have legacies into the present for governance, political culture, social relations, and so forth. So I think it's very important for thinking about South Asian history to move beyond some of these colonial categories, to think about places like Hyderabad in comparison and connection with other similar places in South Asia, in the British Empire, and in many other places. So I think that this provides an entry point to a very new global political geographical sense in places like Hyderabad, which I would call minor states, i.e. places that are not at the top tier of global political authority, but nevertheless are worth considering as political projects where different things can be tried out and go on. And just to kind of briefly give a typology of the kinds of states that one can see in the world in the period from the mid-19th century into the mid-20th. You have dominant major powers such as empires and European, or for that matter, North American states that dominated the nascent and emerging domain of international politics. But there were also several kinds of other sovereign entities which are rarely considered in narratives about the genealogy of politics and society in the modern world. One type of states were what we might call sub-imperial states, states that existed in relation to imperial powers but were not incorporated within it, such as Hyderabad and other South Asian polities such as Kalat or Balochistan in what is now Pakistan, Kashmir, straddling what is now India and Pakistan in that contested borderland region, Mysore, Hyderabad, as well as numerous other much smaller political formations in what are now the territories of Gujarat, Kerala, Rajasthan, Punjab, and even for that matter, Myanmar or Burma. In terms of type, these states resembled numerous other different kinds of polities in the larger British Empire and other empires, such as the Malay states, the Emirates of northern Nigeria, as well as similar political formations in South Africa and the Persian Gulf, and other states in Dutch, French, Ottoman, and Portuguese empires that retained autonomy and law-making and administrative powers, but are now tend to be regarded as something lesser than a formal state or polity. Another form of minor or lesser states are uncolonized states, states that are never formally put under the control of imperial or colonial rule, British or otherwise, but nevertheless are not entirely regarded on the international domain and have to negotiate their status politically and economically in relationship with European powers, often subject to what we might call informal economic or political imperialism. And this includes states such as Siam, modern Thailand, Qajar, Iran, or Persia at the time as it's sometimes referred, Afghanistan, Nepal, both of which closer to South Asia, or Ethiopia. These are all places that are not quite at the top tier of the global level of power, but are comparable in many ways to Hyderabad. A third category of minor sovereign forms are enduring political or environmental frontier zones where state sovereignty as such remains ambivalent, but allows for the improvisation of different forms of power. And these are often worked out through geographical distance from political centers and factors that create what we might call environmental friction. Aridity or desert land that's difficult to cross, high impenetrable hills or dense forests, extremes of temperature, etc. And I think that we see borderland spaces like this in a lot of locations, and very, very prominently, one can also see borderland spaces in the north of what is Hyderabad state, as well as in other sort of neighboring parts of British territory and other princely states to the north, which still remain sites of the exercise of actually existing political autonomy. And one, I think, very important example is the larger region of Bastar Dandakadanya, which is just to the north of Hyderabad state, but is in some ways continuous with the north of Telangana or Asaf Jahi, Hyderabad, in that there is a strong possibility of maintaining political autonomy separate from the oversight of the centralizing state because of the ecological characteristics of the region. So it allows for a certain amount of autonomy. So in sum, I would say that from the perspective of these types of places, states such as Hyderabad, other so-called princely states, Malay states, Nigerian Emirates, non-European states such as Siam or Afghanistan or Ethiopia, actually, one must see sovereignty as a contingent and contested legal and analytical domain, which can be wielded at certain points from lower tiers of a graded political spectrum, at the top of which are dominant European and in some cases American or even Asian imperial powers. So I guess the next question that emerges is, if we think about Hyderabad as a place where a lot of things are going on that are not completely determined by British colonial pressure and power, what possibilities does this create? This is not a space of anarchy. This is a space of political authority of a Muslim-ruled state, which rules based on certain principles that are in some cases related to previous Mughal political ideas. So one of the way that I would characterize this phenomenon is Hyderabad and other minor states become frameworks for different forms of political ethics. So not necessarily political in the sense of electoral or representative per se, but ideas of how the state should relate to the population and different segments of it, what values they should embody, and so forth. Much of this is contained, as I try to establish in the book, within the idea of patrimonial obligations that create a sense of reciprocity between the rulers and elites and subject populations. So the idea that there is some mutual responsibility between the rulers and the elite class and the ruled. Hyderabad officials presented themselves as guarantors or protectors of spaces of labor, dwelling or residence, and worship on the part of state subjects. And these values are reflected in state policy at the urban and rural levels. We also see extensive policies established to protect livelihoods and safeguard the human security of Hyderabadis within the state via social programs such as relief measures in times of famine and projects to incorporate excluded social groups such as Dalits, Adivasis, and other historically marginalized communities, some of which are designated in British India and even Hyderabad as criminal castes and tribes, but who may have had more access to realization of their political wills and livelihoods in Hyderabad state. I'm not suggesting that this is a sort of utopia where all communities are included. I'm simply suggesting there is a framework in place and political values for trying to think about these types of inclusion, which is in very different and in many ways working from different principles than we see within British India. So to be very clear, this broader inclusive vision was certainly impartial, uneven, and in tension with continuing structural and political pressures on marginalized groups, and was certainly in part based on calculations on the part of the regime to broaden its support base in the 1930s and 40s, when there was increasing pressure from the Indian nationalist movement and various resistance movements within Hyderabad from a lot of different fronts. But the presence of explicit state policies to empower marginalized segments of the population, I think, is one useful illustration of the kinds of things that were possible in minor states such as Hyderabad that were not constrained entirely by British colonial power. A couple of the key concepts that I tried to develop in the work for thinking about this, for thinking about the possibilities in Hyderabad. One is just the idea of political experimentation. The idea that states were able to work from a certain set of political ethics and use this and ideas of obligation to the population on the part of the state and so forth, and combine them in an almost experimental fashion with European ideas and examples of political development, Ottoman and other Asian examples as well, as a way to kind of develop forms of political rule, governance, society, culture, and institutional life. So we actually see this in state ideology, institutions, infrastructure projects, forms of welfare, constitutionalism, and law in Hyderabad state, kind of envisioned from the political center, but spreading in complicated ways to the fringes. And we can see very clearly, as I try to show in the book, that Hyderabad draws examples from British India, Britain itself, other parts of Europe. Certainly there's a lot of looking at Germany, France, and elsewhere. Parts of the Americas, Hyderabad officials are looking very closely at the US, Canada. People are studying in these places as well, to some extent South America, as well as places elsewhere in Africa and Asia, such as very, very notably, Japan and the Ottoman Empire. And one theme within some of this looking abroad for examples of political models to emulate and experiment with is the idea that Hyderabad can especially draw models from modernist developments elsewhere in the Muslim world. So for that reason, the Ottoman example is very, very important in the making of the political and institutional culture of Hyderabad state in the era that my book examines. Let's see. A couple of other concepts. One concept which I've already broached is the idea of political ethics, specifically the form of ethical patrimonialism, in which state officials have an obligation to protect the livelihoods of state subjects, and exist in a relationship of reciprocity without formal electoral representation. Another concept that I try to develop is the way that embodied knowledge communities, which I call bureaucrat intellectuals in Hyderabad, fuse together a long history of older political agents in South Asia, such as Munshis, Dubashis, and other expert political thinkers and institutional experts with technical skills of various kinds. We also see from the early 20th century, many Hyderabad bureaucrat intellectuals are very specifically technologically informed figures, and we might say that one type of bureaucrat intellectual that really thrives and is intensively patronized in Hyderabad as important political and social figures is what we might call the planner technocrat, which includes elements of urban planning, architecture, engineering, and various other kinds of technical and bureaucratic skills. So we actually see this becomes a way for Hyderabad to attract planners, engineers, and experimental scientists who are unable to find sufficient patronage in British India, Europe, or elsewhere. Hyderabad in some ways becomes a shelter to a lot of these different kinds of groups who want to work unimpeded by the pressure of colonial state or are unable to find patronage in those domains. The book identifies three main areas of political experimentation. One is ideas, state ideology, and political connections. And a key component of this is taking existing South Asian Perso-Islamicate ideologies of an inclusive and progressive state form and combining this with new idioms of technologically informed and scientific statecraft, such as census, survey, development projects, and so forth. Seemingly different than the colonial state versions of such practices, in part because the deep racial hierarchy that is embedded within colonial thinking as a matter of course seems to have a much more complicated life within Hyderabad, not directly implemented within political planning projects. And we see this officials of the state actively looking to not only the Mughal legacy, but also the legacy of the Qutub Shahi Sultanate, the founders of the city of Hyderabad, formerly ruled from Golconda, but also regional, Hindu, and Buddhist, as well as other state forms that are not easily associated with any particular religious community in the broader Deccan region. So one thing is rethinking the historical legacies that are relevant to thinking about state building in South Asia from Hyderabad is one form of political experimentation. Another is what I would call Muslim internationalism. And this is a term that I use as a sort of alternative to the more common term of pan-Islamism or pan-Islamic politics, to suggest that Muslim internationalism does not necessarily depend on that which is embedded in scriptural or formal religious knowledge and religious expertise, but in many ways is manifest simply by the idea of connections between different Muslims in different parts of the world in a way that is not kind of exclusive of other figures that might not be Muslims religiously as such. The term pan-Islam is a difficult and problematic one because it is part of a colonial ideology for suppressing political dissent. Muslim internationalism might, in some cases, propose alternative or conflicting models to colonial global connections, but at times it is envisioned as something that can work contemporaneously with empire, but does not necessarily imply that it needs to be dismantled. So I'm suggesting that Muslim internationalism really infuses a lot of these Hyderabad networks, sometimes of deeply anti-colonial individuals, but also in some cases of people for whom the existence of empire is not the central political or social or cultural concern. There were certainly scripturally and theologically mediated ideas and networks that circulated in a similar plane, in particular references to the caliphate and its future or the importance of Sharia law or Muslim solidarity. But I would suggest that only looking at explicitly religious connections forms too narrow of a network to examine the really wide-ranging and diverse exchanges between Muslims and Muslim states around statecraft practices and international solidarity. So, for example, I think Hyderabad drawing constitutional ideas from the Ottomans, or thinking about different dynamics of Muslim circulation and mobility in dialogue with people in the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim places such as Malaya or Japan, which becomes a major patron of Muslim connections. I think that these ways and routes of connection are extremely important, and Muslim internationalism allows us to see them more clearly than merely pan-Islam or a focus only on explicitly religious or explicitly anti-colonial exchanges. Critically, these networks of connection are combined with self-consciously and explicitly modern political development in the form of developing material and technologically enabled processes related to economic and political institutions. So this includes industrialization of production, global expansion of capital, urbanization, expanding infrastructure for mobility and communication, railways, steamships, metalled roads, telegraph, telephone, etc., and the increased capacity for state knowledge and, in some cases, regulation of populations. So I would suggest that there is something going on within Hyderabad during this period that we might call a modernist Muslim internationalism, drawing on examples and networks connected with other Muslim thinkers and states that is leveraged to bring forward modernist projects in Hyderabad. And one could mention something like Ottoman constitutionalism as a global internationalist moment. Scholars have recently begun exploring Ottoman constitutionalism and its influence on places such as Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, as well as other parts of South Asia. And this really thrives from the era from the late 19th century through World War II or so. There are several examples one could produce of modernist Muslim internationalism. One would be the founding of Osmania University, in which a lot of imperatives and support networks and forms of knowledge were integrated from figures such as Blunt and Shibli and Asad, who are discussed in the book, to also experimental scientists or planners such as Patrick Geddes, who designed the first layout of Osmania. One example as well is, in particular, the Islamic Culture Journal, founded at Osmania in 1927, which itself is an example of, but becomes a key forum for Muslim modernist thought, internationalism, and providing some context and historical background for these strains of thought. And it's worth noting that there certainly are contemporary as well as later global parallels to Islamic culture that are worth exploring. But I think in its own way, Islamic Culture as a Journal is very much a pioneering publication, and one can think about it in a larger configuration of other contemporaneous and as well as earlier and later publications. Let's see. So beyond Muslim internationalism, I think another form, and ideas in general, another key form of political experimentation that I seek to establish in my book is thinking about the life of institutions, the way that, for example, law, crime, poverty, and social policy in general look differently from the perspective of Hyderabad than they look from the perspective of British India or people that are in a struggle against British India per se, or colonial rule per se. So one thing that we see very clearly in Hyderabad is officials along the borders with places such as Bombay and Madras are pushing hard against British Indian officers to maintain the possibility of autonomy and control over populations in Hyderabad, which might include people migrating into Hyderabad from British India. And we see this on the part of various different kinds of officers and land grant holders, Jagirs, Samastans, etc. So really what we see is a clear example of jurisdictional difference along the loose borders between Hyderabad state and British India. And this becomes a practical, on the ground, very specific and local way of looking at the meanings of minor sovereignty and the possibilities of political experimentation. So for example, one type of group that we see having very different careers between Hyderabad and British India are groups that get marked as hereditary criminals or criminal castes and tribes by legislation in British India. British Indian officials try very hard to expand this type of legislation for targeting and settling and sedentarizing and surveilling particular communities into Hyderabad. And this is very often opposed by Hyderabad officials. Another example would be social welfare policies we see in Hyderabad in the 1930s and 40s, as well as the earlier efforts at famine relief, particularly in the 1870s in the Deccan, where a lot of different forms of what we might describe as progressive legislation are put into place to put a stop to the exacerbation of the famine by capitalist or state inaction, which is very much what's going on in British India. So Hyderabad puts in place rules to prevent land alienation to moneylenders, establishes relief houses and charity for the weaker segments of the population, in great contrast to the British Indian program of expanding work camps where hard labor is given in exchange for any kind of relief. There is some amount of construction and labor that goes on in the famine relief in Hyderabad, but very clearly this work is directly related to providing infrastructure for preventing the worst effects of the famine, such as, for example, water tanks and irrigation channels to try to infuse the rural economy and provide critical food commodities and nutrition and things of sustenance to the population at large. So this is, I think, a very significant phenomenon in Hyderabad that we see in the 1870s. We actually see net in-migration from both Bombay and Madras districts into Asif Jahi state during the worst years of the famine in the mid to late 1870s. Later, in the 1930s and 40s, we see limited but impactful and substantial programs to empower marginalized groups. So, for example, the Dalit community. Hyderabad leadership, under the leadership of the Nizam in particular, but also other high officials, take this on in part as a reflection of state political ethics, but also there's certainly an element of political strategy. There is an attempt to negotiate with Ambedkar, to encourage Dalits to convert not to Buddhism, as is ultimately the choice, but to Islam. And this is part of a larger vision of a Muslim-Dalit alliance that forms part of the bedrock of late Asif Jahi politics, and I think we can see some of the continuity of this into the present. This means including Dalits at high posts or positions within the state. You have important figures who are yoked into this project, such as Shyam Sundar and B.S. Venkatrao. Both of them lauded the cosmopolitanism and inclusiveness of Hyderabad culture. And you have Hyderabad Dalit leaders in alliance with the Nizam's regime, envisioning it, casting it, and seeing it as more conducive to Dalit advancement than the social and political spaces of either neighboring British India or an anticipated post-colonial nation state in the region, which they see as the potential captive of upper caste interests. In addition to social programs for Dalits, we also see social programs in place for a little bit later, more in the 40s, for Adivasis, or so-called tribal communities, primarily in the north and east of the state in the forested and hilly regions. In British India, and to some degree in Hyderabad earlier, Adivasi communities are victims of compulsory sedentarization policy, land grabs, and forest exploitation. We see over the decades, as the Hyderabadi scholar Bukya Bhangya has shown extensively, major insurgency on the part of some Adivasi communities, and particularly Gonds, from the late 19th into the early 20th century. But one of the results of this in Hyderabad is the development of a distinct Hyderabadi Adivasi policy, which is worked through the presence of a key European anthropologist, the Austrian Christoph von Führer Haimendorf, to give a bit of a sense of the dynamics. You have the important, now widely recognized figure in the borderlands of Hyderabad and the central provinces, Komaram Bheem, who activates a powerful insurgency in the 30s and 40s in the areas near Adilabad. And this is in many ways targeted directly against Hyderabad state's failure to rein in exploitation of Dalits by elite figures in agrarian hierarchies in the region. The response is the state policy, the state hires the Austrian Haimendorf, who in fact previously had been working in British India, but because of World War II is forced to leave because as an Austrian, he's defined as an enemy alien. He undertakes in Hyderabad under state support, a tribal welfare initiative, which is centered on a lot of different elements, but one key component of it, so in some cases, integrating Adivasi figures into state bureaucracy and local governance. One key part of it is giving land titles to Adivasis particularly in the northern and eastern regions of Hyderabad state, particularly Telangana. And these forms of tenure are still significant and referred to as Haimendorf patta. So actually his name is sort of enshrined here. And these land titles become a basis for an entry into the public sphere as well as regional bureaucratic networks within the state. Let's see. The last domain that I would introduce in terms of domains of political experimentation is the domain of space, and particularly the making and governing of Hyderabad city. And this is actually a topic that I'm going to look at more closely in my coming research. I'm doing work that is focused explicitly on urban expansion in Hyderabad in the 20th century and how land as property becomes a basis for generating forms of public and provides a way for us to see the different kinds of political rationalities that shape space in South Asia. But very briefly, in the Asif Jahi period, we see in the making and governing of Hyderabad city, the yoking of these ideas of a political ethics of patrimonialism very centrally drawn upon to develop Hyderabad city. So we see the City Improvement Board, a state-appointed agency, constructing model houses for working class segments of the population, various economic development schemes for industrial housing and employment. Some of the examples are drawn from British Indian schemes, but there also is a very wide kind of view of the CIB at global developments in social housing for populations at large. And interestingly, the template for developing social housing or housing for the poor in Hyderabad, what in the US we would call public housing, is actually taken and deployed in Secunderabad by British officials as a model. They use some of the same plans and the same sources of building materials. And this becomes a framework for really the protection of spaces of the poor in Hyderabad, of labor, dwelling, and worship against an expanding colonial urbanist vision. So rather than get more into the depth of examples from the book, let me talk for a couple of minutes in concluding about some of the legacies of Asif Jahi rule after 1948. And I think historical memory as well, and the situation for undertaking this kind of research in contemporary South Asia. So as we all know, in September of 1948, Asif Jahi rule in Hyderabad is extinguished by Operation Polo, colloquially referred to as police action, and the Union of India's military invasion of Hyderabad state and toppling of the Nizam. This is a familiar story. The Asif Jahi administration tries to remain independent. They play, in some ways, Indian and Pakistani officials against one another. They gain some support at certain times, but are unable to sort of leverage that into either an agreement between these entities or international support. And the Indian state, Hyderabad, of course, is in the center of what has already become the Independent Union of India, soon to be the Republic of India. So the Indian state strongly opposes this. There is an alliance that's founded between various grassroots political groups within Hyderabad, largely led by upper caste Hindus, such as the Hyderabad State Congress, as well as the Arya Samaj. The state is taken over by what we might describe as Muslim chauvinist forces. At that time, certainly, as I understand it, the MIM in alliance with the Nizam is very much a force for continuing Muslim political dominance within Hyderabad, despite other strands of thought that exist within the organization and thinking of its leadership. This is a different vision of political authority than what I see reflected in earlier Hyderabad history that I've described. I think this is a vision of political authority as based on Muslim dominance. And this provokes the invasion of the Indian Army and the military conquest in 1948, which then results in really widespread state-sponsored and militia violence, both against those who are Razakars, who are affiliated with the sort of loyalist MIM forces, but also against many other segments of the population associated with the state. Officials, sometimes Muslims at large. We are only now in the last decade or so starting to get a sense of the depth of political violence and disenfranchisement and marginalization, not only of Muslims, but of a lot of other figures who are viewed as anti-Indian state. This is also tied in some ways in the communist Telangana uprising as well. And these all turn into opportunities for the Indian state to really sink deeper their modes of political control and suppression of dissent into the larger Telangana region, as well as Hyderabad state more broadly. There's a failed UN campaign afterwards in the late 40s and 50s through which Hyderabad seeks to get recognized and bring up the Union of India for a violation of sovereignty. This is never recognized. And really what we have left are not formal political continuity, but a significant amount of institutional, cultural, and smaller scale continuities between the history of the Asif Jahi state and the contemporary. So, for example, a lot of urban and urbanist institutions have continuous lives. The City Improvement Board becomes later the Andhra Pradesh Housing Board, as well as subsequently continuing its life as a housing entity within Hyderabad more broadly. So some of these urban development initiatives continue. We still see some political alliances in place. And in fact, the MIM in the 80s in particular begins to sort of re-envision itself as a framework, not for Muslim political dominance, but as a party that represents the interests of Muslims and can formalize and strengthen this based on an active alliance between Muslims and Dalits, something of what we have seen in Hyderabad state as well, kind of political developments that many of you will know much more intimately than I will as an external researcher. Also worth saying that the historical memory of Hyderabad state under the Nizam looms very large as well. The idea of a inclusive, diverse, composite cultural state and idea, which is one that certainly predates the Asif Jahi state in the Deccan, and is linked in some ways to Persianate and other forms of cosmopolitanism, is still extremely important. We see some of this brought up in the Telangana movement for autonomy and its claims, and certainly that is a movement for reinstalling parts of Hyderabad of former Asif Jahi Hyderabad as an autonomous political space. We see, for example, similar movements for political autonomy in the other parts of former Asif Jahi Hyderabad, Marathwada, Hyderabad, Karnataka, sometimes now officially known as Kalyana, Karnataka, regions that previously had been a part of Hyderabad state and had embedded some of the logics of development as well as political configurations between social groups. These are largely seeking to realize that, or there are movements that seek to realize the autonomy of these regions. And one could even potentially include a place such as Vidarbha, a region that previously, before the 1850s, had in fact been a substantial and important part of Hyderabad and still was integrated into some of its networks and political ideas. In closing, however, I would say that these historical connections are very hard to realize on the formal state and political level. And I think this is a struggle that now needs to be taken up and has been taken up to some extent through the domain of grassroots political organization and mobilization, as well as maybe on some level through electoral politics. The reason for this is that sovereignty no longer vests within Hyderabad itself or surrounding regions or the Deccan as a whole. This is not a kind of container for legitimate state power as a provincial state within a larger India that is subject to the sort of pressures, obligations of the national level government. So sovereignty is now in the nation state. It's not divisible in the same way at lower levels as was the case before World War II or before the mid-1940s and decolonization. We see older and more complex ideas and forms of sovereignty, often at the lower level, resonate. And I think that they have much to teach us about the competing factions and groups and possibilities of the political present, even as they've been pushed out of the domain of state power. And just briefly, a last note that I want to make is just about doing archival work on this kind of stuff. Now, when I did the research on this project, primarily in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, I was in Hyderabad for nearly a year, and then a couple of subsequent trips after that over the next decade or so before the book was published. It was not easy to work in the Hyderabad archives. You had to kind of deal with a lot of officials who did not want to give you documents or a certain amount of bureaucratic intransigence. This was the case in Delhi to some degree as well at the National Archives and in the Maharashtra State Archives, where I worked to look at border matters. Unimaginably, however, or to me at least, for a lot of different political and institutional reasons that are familiar to many of you, it may now be even more difficult to do the kind of research in India that shaped this book. Archives are increasingly underfunded. The Telangana and AP archives, because of bifurcation, are now very much in a state of flux, both in terms of the collections and access, as well as support and staffing. And the spaces for thinking about the complex genealogies of the political present that include the Asif Jahi state are increasingly foreclosed in what we might describe as an era of global majoritarian populism. I know firsthand that many, especially younger scholars, no doubt including some of you now or in the future, are working to push against some of these tendencies to produce politically engaged histories. And many of you here know far better than I do the difficulties that one needs to navigate to be able to do this, and how crucial it is to have strong support networks in India and beyond. So as such, I want to just say I appreciate and laud the work of this group and others in keeping the possibilities that we might see in the history of Hyderabad state politically alive and resonant, so we can use that as a resource for thinking about our political present and ways of realizing different forms of progress and liberation. And as I said at the beginning, I am really extremely keen to hear more about why these topics and questions are of interest to people in this group, based on local and contemporary happenings or other sources of comparison that people might be thinking of. But with that, I'll sort of stop and open things up so we can have a wider conversation. So I'll hand it over to the organizers or moderators or whoever wants to sort of take over moderating.
Thank you very much, sir, for such an enlightening session. You have tried to cover multiple topics in such a short span of time. Now it's time for our audience to ask questions. You can raise your hand so that I can unmute anyone who want to ask question. As we have discussed many things in collective reading sessions, many of them I think have many questions to you. So they can raise your hand so that
now
I can
unmute. Asif is here.
Yes.
Asif is ready with
I'll unmute. brother Asif Akram. He is pursuing his PhD from IIT Bombay. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So, very fascinating talk and a very fascinating book. I have read parts of the book. What interests me is to know how a state, a so-called minor state like Hyderabad, can organize itself and can create a kind of firewall against this whole big British Empire. So, I have two questions related to this state. The first question is, how would you rate Hyderabad as compared to other princely states when it comes to modernity, modern bureaucracy, and progress in administrative department? What role did modern technology play in the making of modern Hyderabad? And post independence, did Hyderabad retain its uh, essential character? And my second question is regarding the Muslimness you have talked about in your first chapter and Hyderabad. So, how do you define Muslimness and what role did Hyderabad play in creating Muslim network and preserving this Muslimness, so-called Muslimness? And was it a kind of definite Indian Islam that people talk about? Um, yeah. So if you can just elaborate on those points.
Thanks. Should I go ahead and address those questions, or do we want to take a few at once? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So first of all, that's a very interesting way to put it. I think the idea of Hyderabad maintaining a firewall against the British Empire, and I think there's a couple of things that I could say about that. So for one thing, I don't think that there's a kind of successful. It's not thoroughly successful, the attempt to keep out influence and pressure from British India in terms of on the ground politics. I mean, we certainly see a lot of inroads on the part of anti-colonial nationalism, which in Hyderabad tends to take primarily the form of Hindu majoritarian aspirations for political authority, or state pressures. So Hyderabad needs to develop its own Thuggi and Dacoity department as under the pressure of the British colonial state. So this is not a sort of matter in which there is kind of complete hermetic sealing of Hyderabad from outside interests. But at the same time, that doesn't mean Hyderabad is not a sovereign place. And I think that Hyderabad deploys a lot of various different strategies, some of them deliberate, some of them that kind of happen because of the structure of the state itself. The structure of the state itself is one in which the kind of centralization that we see in a dominant political entity such as an empire is very much not the case, or at least in the British Empire in its later stages of consolidation and institutional and infrastructural expansion. So Hyderabad state is a place where many officials in different regions hold judicial and policing powers. This is not sort of leveled out by a state writ, and even if there was an attempt to do this, it might not have been possible. And this in some ways is an instantiation of a more early modern, almost Mughlai form of power, where the strength of the state is dependent on the abilities and will and capacity to develop networks of individual entities that are empowered by the state, whether you're talking about jagirdars or some stan holders or local officials, revenue officials, border officials, etc. So one way that Hyderabad does push this off is by simply saying, well, actually, and one can look at very small cases on the borders that happen, is simply the British will write and say, hey, there are some people here that are sheltering criminals or are taking salt across the border, which is something that's an excise commodity or opium or whatever it is, or guns. And what happens ultimately is the Hyderabad state officials, first of all, they take a really long time to write back. So there's a tactic of delay. Second of all, there is very frequently a reference to say, well, actually, we can't say, we cannot dictate terms in terms of the management of trade within this district because this district is under the control of this Jagirdar who holds this grant from the state and has autonomous control over the region. We can inquire as to what their policies are and how those match up with those of British India. So this is a sort of very fine-grained, on-the-ground firewall of sorts that certainly is a little bit leaky. The British are certainly able to kind of assert their will to some extent, but Hyderabad does, I think, in many ways successfully defend their jurisdiction. The other question you ask, there's a couple of other questions that you ask combined with that one. One of which is how I would rate Hyderabad vis-a-vis other states, other princely states, or British India, or other states in the world. So first of all, I would say I don't know that this kind of graded rating of states on what are fairly subjective measurements is really possible. I think one could look at sort of numerical data to do comparisons. So for example, I think one thing that's very, very telling is the in-migration to Hyderabad in the time of the 1870s famine that is mentioned by British officials themselves as well. I think that does show the extent to which Hyderabad was attractive to a lot of people in the borderlands because of the possibilities of evading the worst effects of the famine that were put in place by state policy and weren't put in place by state policy within British India. One thing that I think is germane to think about here is the British, a lot of observers, as well as a lot of nationalists, did in fact perform a ranking of princely states and their progress and modernity. This was not in terms of, number one, number two, number three, etc., but this was more about different categories. And there is a category of states that is reproduced in a lot of scholarly literature as well, that many of you no doubt have seen, which speaks of the so-called progressive states, as opposed to the so-called backward states. And invariably, the progressive states are Hindu-ruled states, primarily in the south and west of what is now India. So you see a lot of writings in the colonial period and after. This gets completely absorbed by scholars who are writing about princely states up until very, very recently, that talks about places such as Mysore, Baroda, Travancore, as progressive states which are realizing liberal institutions, abolishing oppressive laws, etc., working against sort of caste and so forth. So this whole rhetoric of progressive states, however, is one that is very much tied to particular kinds of states, mostly Hindu-ruled states, or exclusively Hindu-ruled states. This is not expanded to talk about states such as Hyderabad, Bhopal, and other locations that might, in fact, and are, as I've looked at in Hyderabad, pursuing what we might describe as progressive political development and legislation and policy. I mean, there's been a lot of really interesting and powerful work done on not only the politics of gender in Bhopal because the rulers are women, but also the politics of gender on the ground and in terms of the wider populace, access to education, mobility, etc. So I think that the whole conversation about ranking states as being more progressive has been one that's very much skewed and does not include in the conversation places like Hyderabad and Baroda. So rather than saying I would rank it above or below this place or that, I would say we need to have a broader conversation about progressive trends that we see, the trends that we might call progressive. That's itself a kind of fairly subjective term. Trends that we might define as progressive in various ways in British India broadly, but also in various other princely states as legacies to think about for integrating into our contemporary understanding of South Asia. The question about whether Hyderabad retains its essence into the post-colonial period is, again, this is a little bit difficult to answer because that means we have to say what Hyderabad's essence actually is. And I think that there are a lot of elements that carry over. I think there are certain forms of expertise, technocratic knowledge, political ethical ideas, various global networks and connections, scientific inquiry through funded institutions, etc., that certainly we can see in Hyderabad and actually become bigger and more widespread in some sense when Hyderabad is integrated into the Union of India, which in fact I think at one time prompted Jawaharlal Nehru to propose Hyderabad as a second capital, both because of its geographical location, but also because of the sort of development of certain kinds of industry and avenues of intellectual and scientific inquiry there. So I think there are a lot of ways we can see different aspects of Hyderabad's essences continue over time. But I would really hesitate before saying one thing or another was actually the essence of Hyderabad, because I think that reduces a very, very complicated phenomenon. In terms of Muslimness, the reason I use this term is because it allows us to really sidestep what are a lot of discussions that I think make it hard to think about the resonance of connections between different Muslim people at the political and social level. When one uses the term Islam or Islamicness, that implicitly, or in fact explicitly, references ideas of shared faith. And that means then that one needs to define actually what entails being Islamic. And I think that's a very, very complicated question that scholars, Muslims, non-Muslims, academics, scholars in other forms, ulama, etc., have debated over for many, many years and not found a clear answer. For some, what it means to be Islamic excludes some people that consider themselves Muslims. For others, there's a more expansive definition, but that'll be objected to by many as well. So that actually, in some ways, I think forces one to focus on these theological discussions of group identity. So I've preferred what I think is a somewhat more open and inclusive term in thinking about Muslimness, simply a basis for connection between people who regard themselves or states or elites who regard themselves as Muslims, rather than getting into the question of theology and definitions of the boundaries of community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot. It was a lengthy answer to that. I got a few questions. First thing is regarding as you have mentioned about the Telangana and the separation of the Telangana state that comes into existence. So in continuation of that your book ends at 1950, but the whole politics of Mulki rule. So again, the Mulki rule, the discussion that was there should be a Mulki rule, there should be some kind of limitation with regard to the employment, and that leads to the constitutional amendment. So how do you see, because you have stopped your discussion at 1950, but there was some continuation with regard to the policies of the Nizam, and this Mulki rule finds its place into the constitution itself. So in a way, I understand that although the Asif Jahi dynasty gets end at 1948, but its policy do impact the constitution itself. So if you have any idea, or you would like to alter the opinion, or would like to give any elaborate answer to that, I wish that.
Well, this is in fact a question that many of you might have more studied and informed answers than I do. The book does end in 1950 or so, in large part because that is the nature of the archives to which one has access. There are fairly strict laws in India in terms of release of archival data after a certain period. So my task was to view the life of Hyderabad state, and the kind of legacy was something of a sort of secondary consideration. I'm very interested in looking at the legacy now, but that comes more in the form of very specific domains and areas. And I've not looked, in fact, so much at the kind of effects on constitutional law on an India-wide basis. But I think, yeah, I mean, what you say is definitely worth thinking about and looking into further. The extent to which mulkiness or certain dominant state communities are recognized in constitution or in amendments to constitution as a basis for certain kinds of entitlements. And we've seen expansions of this, and we've seen this get politicized, usually not within the framework of simply residence, but residence within an area for a certain amount of time, which is the definition of mulki as I understand it, but usually actually more within the framework of enumerated linguistic, or in some cases ethnic or caste communities claiming entitlements of various different kinds. So I think that actually the idea of mulki rule, i.e. people that have lived in a certain place for a certain amount of time, as a basis for entitlement to employment or state office or educational spots or what have you, is actually another way to think about and reflect upon some of the debates over constitutional entitlement in India and other places for that matter today. But yeah, I mean, I think this is something I'd like to actually hear some of your thoughts on, or maybe some of those of others who are more directly involved, such as yourself, Ghiyasuddin Saab, in contemporary legal discussions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I have been saying that this whole discussion from the constitutional perspective, and this 29th state, the formation of Telangana itself is an outcome of that, because the Mulki rule played an important role in the discussion, and also the demands that were there in the student movement regarding the implementation of Mulki rule. And then there was a gentleman's agreement, and all that were kept aside by the Congress High Command, which led to the regional discrimination within the state. So moving on to the another discussion that is from our Syed Muhammad. He is a journalist of The Hindu, covers the Hyderabad region, and he got a question. I will just read it out to you. Wait for a while. On the page 137, Professor Beverley speaks about Bahadur Yar Jang's Anjuman-e-Tabligh Islam. And now, how correct is the translation, and how could speak more on that this organization facilitated the conversion of Dalit, wherein you have concluded that there was a...
I need to look at the page to know exactly what he's referring to.
Yeah, 137, wherein it says that your translation gives an impression that there was a conversion of Dalits, and how it is correct. Yeah, I too have a book.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something that I've done direct original archival research on, as I include there a footnote from which various scholars, this includes also work on the life of Bahadur Yar Jang by Naziruddin Ahmed, also English work by Lucien Benichou, Marguerite Pernot, Ian Copland, as well as Ian Copland, who all discuss the project of conversion. And some of the accounts say that the Anjuman-e-Tabligh-e-Islam, in fact, converted tens of thousands, or maybe claimed to do so. I can't, of course, verify this. I haven't done the primary work on that particular topic, but, and if any of you know better about the situation, I believe the querist mentions having written a book on this topic. I'd like to know more about the historical assessment of that data, because I'm drawing that from existing scholarship. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sir, would you like to say more?
I would like to request Syed Muhammad, if he's here, to elaborate on this, because yeah, another scholar is here to would like to speak. Just I will unmute him.
Good evening. I'm an admirer of your work. Firstly, let me put that out. I just had there's this whole political discourse in connection with conversions, which we get to hear a lot in India these days. I was hoping if you could throw some more light on these conversions which you speak of, and I've also read the footnotes. I would really be grateful if you could expound on that. And secondly, I was just wondering, this is not a question as such, but I was just wondering whether this Anjuman-e-Tabligh-e-Islam, the translation for that particular organization, of the name of the organization, would that be in a manner of speaking accurate or in consonance with the kind of work that was done by this particular organization? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I appreciate these sort of interventions regarding the translation of the name of the organization itself and their activity. As I said, I'm drawing this sentence, or this couple of sentences, from existing scholarly accounts. This is not something I've done primary research on myself, and I would sort of cede to people who have actually done deep research. And I believe that we have, or actually maybe he's gone now. I saw one, Mohammed Ayub Khan, who has been doing work on Badr Yarjung himself, who may know more about this as well. I'm working based on the material that is cited in the secondary sources there. So I'm not claiming direct primary knowledge of the actual activities. I'm citing what has been said about this political entity to which Badr Yarjung was attached as well. So I can't really elaborate more as to whether this is correct or incorrect, because this is one small thing about his life that I'm noting, which is no doubt important, but has a minor role in the narrative here.
Yeah, I will unmute him, wait for a while.
And in fact, there are scholars, perhaps among some of the people here, who have done intensive work on Badr Yarjung and the Majlis more broadly, and perhaps also the Anjuman at Tabligh Islam, who can sort of fill in a bit more. And, were I to rewrite a second edition, this is the kind of thing where subsequent scholarship would become very useful.
Yeah. Thank you, Riyasa, for unmuting me. Thanks, Eric. If I can just add to it, Bahadur Yarjung never himself claimed to have converted thousands of people. And if you look at his letters, he finds, he's constantly asking the Muballighin or the missionaries, if I can translate it as that, he's constantly telling them to, be up to the job, because most of the time he found them lacking. They were not doing the job. There were problems with the other Muslims incorporating the new converts into the community. So there are a series of problems. From what I have seen, that project wasn't that great a success as has been claimed by Naziruddin Ahmad and others.
Thanks. That's very, very useful. I do think that certainly, and I think, one of the places that these questions are coming from are contemporary concerns about the politicization of conversion as a way to target communities and so forth who are assumed to have been involved with these types of projects at one point or another. I think it's critical to be very careful with the sources here. I've cited, as I said, I cite the secondary sources I drew this information from, and those accounts do talk about his role in the organization's conversion of a lot of people. Whether that actually happened is unclear. It could be that Ahmed or Benichu or any of these scholars are reading internal accounts that describe and perhaps exaggerate successes or what were viewed as successes, etc. So I don't want to sort of suggest that, and I don't think I do in the book, suggest that this in fact actually happened and is documented in that sense. In fact, the book doesn't pretend to talk about numbers of actual accomplishments on that front. The book, I think, does talk about documentation of the construction of different kinds of housing units, but for the most part, I would sort of attribute any numerical data or information there to what I've drawn from existing secondary scholarship by scholars who focus on those things. And again, important to update when work of scholars such as Ayub and others comes out to correct these misleading narratives.
So moving on to these discussions, in continuation of that legacy, what we missed out with regard to the Hyderabad and the Hyderabad state as such, there is the reason for which we have selected is we discusses about the person and the events that defines the Hyderabad memory. Whenever we speak about the Nizam, it's about the wealth and the lavish living, and then we end up with the Operation Polo. But we won't discuss about the policies. And your book is about the policy that were taken by the regime. What I found is that the 1948, this is the end of an era, but there was a 2-year military rule. And that 2-year military rule is unexplored. And have you ever got into that? Have you found any kind of narrative out of that? What was happening in that 2 years of military rule? If you can share your points on that, that will be helpful to continue the talk.
It's a very rich and important topic, and I think the kinds of processes that are taken into place in the late 1940s that really continue into the 50s in not only integrating Hyderabad, but actually integrating a lot of spaces, creating policed borders, and hemming in various communities. And this includes a lot of Muslims as well as numerous other groups who had much more ambivalent relationships to who had very ambivalent relationships to what eventually emerges as the Union and later Republic of India. I think a lot of these histories are yet to be written. For Hyderabad, there's been some good work done on the proliferation of militias and how these forms of political mobilization and militarization are then yoked into state processes by the scholar Sunil Purushottam, who's recently published a book largely on Hyderabad. There's also been some work a little bit earlier done by the scholar Taylor Sherman, which looks at citizenship in post-colonial Hyderabad in particular, focused on a few different communities for whose citizenship status is placed under pressure or revoked, many of them being Muslim communities who had settled for quite a long time, but still retain some kind of notional connection to other places, a topic upon which others here certainly would have much more to say than I. I think I don't know, are there even government documents or archival materials from the period of military rule that explicitly address that available in public archives? I'm not really sure, actually.
Yeah, this comes to me when I was writing about the constitutional amendment and the Telangana movement. I just got a passing reference regarding to this, because whenever we discuss about, we directly jump to 1950, that is state reorganization. So what was happening in that 2 years or 5 years is an unexplored region for an historian, also for those who are into the history. So moving on to the discussion, if there is
which is one thing to add, Ghiyasuddin Saab. For me, these are questions that are of interest, but I think for me, the place that I'm going to view these will be through a much narrower lens. So I'm not going to try to take on the whole kind of history of all state life and institutions as it fragments and is pressurized in the late 40s and then early 50s. But certainly in my work that I'm continuing and doing now about urban land claims, I know one of the processes that's going on is, first of all, military establishment and control of lands, but also breaking out old cantonment military and civil lands to popular uses. So I think through specific land claims that might connect to military property of various kinds. I mean, I know a lot of the estate lands of Hyderabad nobles, paigas, etc., as well as the regime itself, the Sarf-e-Khas, the ruling family, are in fact seized and converted to military purposes, but that sometimes results in negotiation and contestation over tenure or ownership. So I think through this fairly narrow lens of urban land, I will hopefully be able to get some sense of the types of reconfigurations that are happening in that period. But the big picture is one which I don't know that we're in a position to tell yet, and certainly this is not something that I'm trying to do myself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Moving on, if there is any other question that you would like to ask.
We have Brother Osama Huzari. He is also a journalist. I would like to ask him to unmute himself. I am unmuting him right now. You can unmute yourself.
Hello, Mr. Beverley. So I have a few questions and also clarity on some things. So the first question is that you've said that the Nizam state was very inclusive and like there was it was more inclusive than what historians have usually portrayed, right-wing historians. So one of the criticism of that is that Nizam's inclusion was only limited to cities and big cities, not rural areas. Many people have alleged that like in rural areas, the Nizam's government was not as inclusive as it was in Hyderabad. And second question is, it is a bit a little odd question. People say that if Hyderabad was not occupied by India, it would have been like UAE or Qatar today. What do you have to say about that? And another question.
Please ask academic questions. We are not here to discuss something out of blue.
I mean, I'm a journalist, so from that perspective, okay, sorry.
Please avoid that. We are not here to.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think that we can have these conversations, even if we don't answer even if I can't take on the questions directly. I think we're free to ask them.
So another question I had from you was that what made you write a book about Hyderabad and why Hyderabad and why particularly the Nizam's period? Because usually people look at the Qutub Shahi period and the period before that. Why the Nizam's period and why Hyderabad? And another question was about your definition of Muslim nationalism and criticism of pan-Islamism. Like, how do you define pan-Islamism? Because usually Muslim nationalism is something I've read for the first time. And I don't see a lot of difference. Like you said that pan-Islamism is derived from a religious basis, right? But then again, the Western conception of religion is very different from what we learn about religion, right? So that is something that I needed more clarity on. And many people have criticized your book. Like I've asked around a few people who've read your book. They've said that your book is very pro-Nizam. And especially we're living in an era where Nizam ki aulad or children of Nizam is used as a Islamophobic slur against Muslims. So can you give some clarity and answer the questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these provocative questions. So first of all, I think, I would say that compared to the historical image that we have received in popular discourse and in much scholarship, much of which I think is shaped by colonial ideology about Muslim rule as being oppressive, which I think is the vision of Muslim rule in a lot of colonial ideology. I think that relative to those ideas, we can see a lot of ways in which Hyderabad state is conceived and to some degree practiced as a space for inclusion. I by no means am trying to actually make the argument that Hyderabad is in effect, in all domains, in all places, for all people, actually an inclusive state under the rule of what by any measure is certainly an autocratic, elite-dominated regime in which the elite is primarily drawn from the Muslim community, however defined. So I'm not suggesting that Hyderabad is a sort of utopian, all-inclusive democratic place. I'm simply saying that there are a lot of projects of progressive inclusion that are conceived on a lot of frameworks, and in some cases going back to Mughal and other ideas of Persianate cosmopolitanism in place in Hyderabad. Absolutely true that these are more clear in the city itself. I think they're probably clear in other settings as well, but these would be spotty and very uneven across space. And in fact, as I described, part of the way that Hyderabad maintained, not really by design, but by structure, a firewall against British intervention was because of the fact that authority was fragmented across the state. You have samstans, you have jagirs, you have paiga estates, you have various other kinds of territories that are, by law and in practice, autonomous spaces with separate judicial and policing powers. This gets leveled out to some degree at certain moments, but this is never entirely the case. So one of the results of this is that within any of these given territories or spaces, there is the possibility of enormous hierarchical oppression and exploitation of communities within those spaces. So I'm by no means, and this is sheltered by the very structure of Hyderabad state. I wouldn't say this is consciously the political project as such of the Nizam or particular elites or officials or the central government, but this is the de facto way that Hyderabad works and functions. And the fragmentary nature of authority fits with this larger model of patrimonial networks as the basis for state. So I think it's absolutely true that, yes, we can certainly find places in Hyderabad where oppression of some communities and social, ethnic, political, linguistic, religious hierarchies are more glaring than they might be in parts of British India. But this is not to say that Hyderabad corresponds to this image of the oppressive Muslim state that we have been given from historiography and predominates in a lot of popular culture in a very long era of Islamophobia that extends from the colonial period or earlier up into, in many ways, into the present in complicated forms. So I think that that's absolutely right. I think as Ghiyasuddin Saab mentions, typically academics and particularly historians are very uncomfortable answering what one might describe as contrary to fact questions. What if Hyderabad was independent? Would it become, Abu Dhabi or Qatar or Brunei or what have you? I don't think that we can really answer these questions. I don't think that, those are all historically very, very different kinds of states than Hyderabad with much smaller populations that I think also comparatively the degree of elite dominance is quite significant. I think we can comfortably say that Hyderabad as a kind of large, expansive, massive, extensively Dalit, a group that's getting extensively empowered, a state where the Muslim population is also in a very, very small minority. It is hard to imagine, and without something like the resource of petroleum to develop into a basis for thoroughgoing state power and authority, I think it's almost impossible to imagine Hyderabad becoming a mirror image of those locations if that were to be the case. I do think that we have a lot of trouble thinking about the legacies of places such as Hyderabad, or, for example, Kano or Johor, other sort of autonomous principalities within imperial space that didn't happen to become independent at the time of decolonization. So, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Nigeria, South Africa, all became consolidated nation states with some relatively autonomous zones, but ones which did not have formal legal independence as had been the case previously. So I think it's very hard to think about those historical legacies because they get overwritten by narratives of inclusive and consolidating nationalism and their imperatives. What would UAE and Qatar, or for that matter, any number of other places that remained independent, the trucial states as a whole, what would these places have become had you had the development of an inclusive state form on the principle of a transition to a democratic government? One doesn't know this either. So I think that these kind of contrary to fact questions are ones that can help us think about some of the assumptions that we need to unpack and some of the things that we have trouble examining, but not ones that we can answer with any surety or clarity, certainly not as responsible scholars and intellectuals. Your question about pan-Islam versus Muslim nationalism, or as I put it, Muslim internationalism. So I think, I don't want to suggest that I understand things in the way that people do who might understand Islam and what it means to be a Muslim in different and more inclusive ways. I am a scholar that is trained within the framework of rational, academic, evidence-based inquiry, and evidence is limited to a certain type of formats, which publish sources, other types of things that might be construed as texts, if we include them as interviews, etc., as well as an analytical take on those types of materials. So for that reason, an internal view as to what Islam as a form of solidarity signifies would be very, very different than what I can convey within the framework of the boundaries of the discourse of academia. So for that reason, within the discourse of academia, using the term Islamic or Islam has a heavier weight and an impulsion towards religious interpretation. And that's the reason why I, wrong or right, chose the term Muslim and Muslimness. I also would add, as I tried to explain earlier, the term pan-Islamic is one that is coined by colonial officials as a way to identify threats to European political authority. What I describe as Muslim internationalism in Hyderabad does not necessarily have a single political direction, for one. So Muslim internationalism is not explicitly anti-colonial as pan-Islamism has been constructed, even if a lot of Muslim internationalist thinkers themselves may have been anti-colonial or trying to think about alternatives to empire that might in some cases exist parallel to empire. So that is the reason why I made this choice, because I think that using terms such as Islamic and pan-Islamic, first of all, forces us to see things in some ways the way that colonial commentators do. And second of all, places a focus on religion and theological alliances or shared doctrine, which I don't think is necessary to think about connections between different people who happen to be Muslims. So that's how I would address that question. In terms of the last question, yeah, I certainly have heard this from people before, that the book is a little bit too soft on the Nizam, or perhaps too respectful of or too admiring of the political project there. That's not really what I'm trying to do. I understand that it might come off that way to some readers who might be oriented to seeing past regimes, and particularly in some cases Muslim-ruled regimes, as being inherently despotic. That's very much the character of colonial discourse and a lot of Indian nationalist discourse in the late colonial period, in the early post-colonial period, and up into this day in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a difficult question. I think that there is some specter of Islamophobia to say that writing about progressive politics in Hyderabad state is ignoring the big picture. I mean, again, I think it's one of these things where people might have an assumption about the nature, the essence and nature of the state as a whole. And the larger narrative about the essence and nature of the state as a whole is one that is very much informed by Islamophobic ideas. I'm not trying to kind of let the regime off and celebrate it for universal liberation or creating a utopian space, but at the same time, I do think it's important and useful to recognize political possibilities for inclusion, representation, social justice, and social mobility that are happening even under autocratic regimes that might provide useful models for contemporary political shaping. I hope that addresses some of the questions. I know that they come from a somewhat different place in terms of a journalistic perspective and a perspective on the ground, but I do think that's one of the useful things that can come out of this kind of conversation.
Thank you. We have with us Anuradha Reddy ma'am. He is an convener of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, abbreviated as INTAC Hyderabad. So I will ask her to ask a question. I have unmuted ma'am. You can.
I think more than a question, I would like to comment on these last inquiries that came to you. Am I being heard? Is it clear?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thanks.
I would like to point out first that I'm a Mulki Hyderabad. We have been discussing this. One should know that there is a sense of identity. Somebody said that had Hyderabad been left alone, would it become Qatar or UAE? I would like to add that it would have remained as Hyderabad. One has to recognize also that 85% of Hyderabad state was Hindu. That we spoke so many languages. That, of course, there would be some heavier side of Muslim employment in certain areas, maybe in the army, things like that. But in administration and in several areas, it was impossible to work without the Hindu populations. I would like to also mention the Samasthans, because it was not the Nizam and any central unit managing the whole of the state. It was heavily dependent on the Hindu Samasthans that preceded the Islamic movements of this area of the Deccan. We then negotiated with the first Islamic coming to the Deccan. We survived Aurangzeb. We then made friends with the Qutub Shahs of Golconda. We had agreements with the Asaf Jahis. And until 1948, we worked together. I would like to add at this point that my father, who was naturally a Hindu, but his school friends, and until the end of his life, they were both Muslim, they were Kayast, and at no point did I ever think or did I ask a question, is this man Muslim or Hindu? It was automatic, it was an understanding. I would like to compliment your work, Eric, because I have not read it, but hearing your comments, I would like to say it is not praising the Nizam, but it is a documentation of the work of that period that allowed us today to stumble into an old drain which still works, which is then built at the time of the Nizam. And the new drains that put in today at different levels do not connect to the old system and create floods. I'm mentioning these things because even the records that are maintained, the records that are kept, are so perfect that one can refer to something 70 years ago or 100 years ago and come up with the right kind of information. This is what is lacking today in our administration. Shall we blame somebody or shall we praise somebody for letting people do their work? We have recently had what is called the NSI, that is the National Numismatic Society of India meeting after 80 years in Hyderabad. And we have been working on the mint, the 3 Hyderabad mints, that is Sultan Shahi at Darul Shafa and now in the Saifabad area. And on a recent visit to the old mint, which has been reopened, not for public, but for some particular inspection, we are seeing the perfection of one aspect of the coin making of the currency. And this brings me to the use of language on railway stations, in our currency, in our coins, in every aspect that the citizen is made to feel comfortable. Whether we had Marathi, whether we had Kannada, whether we used English, whether we used Telugu, it was to make people comfortable and to create a sense of inclusion in this. So these are just very few comments that I wanted to make. I have been invited by Gyas to moderate, but I must say I don't find very much to moderate because you're covering all these aspects. One has to be clear, one has to be open-minded, and one has to think when you read your book. I have not read it, but I have gone through what you have been saying, which is the essence of the book. I look forward to reading it, but every single aspect of that is part of my life, the part of my growing up, and the part of our ancestral heritage of the region. I feel a great sense of deprivation when I travel to Marathwada today, or I travel to the Karnataka, Hyderabad regions, because if you look at the industries that have been initiated in these areas, whether it is textile, whether it is mining, whether it is any kind of thing, these are all either have been shut or they're continuing to work for us today. Singareni is working for the country, not anymore for Hyderabad state. Water systems like Usman Sagar and Himayat Sagar are working today as both flood and drought control. And these have not been done by a Muslim ruler for Muslims. They are made for everybody. Whether it is an agricultural system, whether it is a jail system, whether it is the kind of institutional structures that we have today with us, just for one example, on the banks of the river Musi, whether it is the High Court, the City College, which is now 100 years old, which is the Osmani General Hospital, which is the Asafia Library, just in this one stretch. And if we widen it to the Legislative Assembly today, which was built as a town hall, and if you go further to Osmania University, you will see that every one of the buildings there is not one department in one room. It is physics in one building. It is geology in one whole building. It just shows the planning. You mentioned Patrick Geddes, that he was called here to plan this kind of environmental space before we put buildings into it. If you understand that, you will understand the ruler that has given us today this city and the open space that we have in Hyderabad today. That there was a railway that took building material to the back of the chemistry department to carry material, that there was a railway that took building material to Usman Sagar. All of these things show the planning, show the thinking, and show the open-minded of the ruler to leave it to the experts and the officials to do their work. I don't think they sat there, nodded their heads and said, yes, Huzur, we'll do this, we'll do that. I think they did their work. And if you look at the employment pattern, the modernization in terms of transport happened also during initially the last period of Mahbub Ali Khan, and of course then Usman Ali Khan, because this is what brought to us modern transportation, first by railway, then the bus system, the aviation systems, and that we enjoy all of these things here today. The railway network in the Deccan has contributed hugely, connecting the rest of the country, south, north, east, west. So one has to think of these things and not say that narrowly this is made for Muslims by Muslims. They were not the only population in the country. At no time, growing up at our generation, we were told that these are Muslims, we will not be friends. I would like to just explain quickly that when there were Muslim festivals, the children of my father's friends, they would be made new clothes and they would make the same set of clothes for me. When we celebrated Diwali or Ugadi, that is the Telugu New Year, we made the same clothes for me that we made also for our Muslim friends' daughters. So it is a sharing. I would like also to mention cuisine at this point. When we went to a Muslim household to celebrate, they would not serve beef. When they came to our homes, of course, we never also ate pork in our homes, but we never served pork at the table. So it is an understanding of each other's cultures. It is an acceptance of the differences, at the same time respecting similarities. And these are just a few things that the young people of today, the young Muslim community of today should know, should remember, and should try and practice in spite of any other pressures that are coming on them under the present circumstances. I really congratulate you for the kind of research, the kind of commitment, and also that you've expressed the pain of looking for work, looking for data in our archives. We understand, we support you, but still keep working, because people like you and like my friend Karen Leonard, who has worked so much on Hyderabad. Somebody asked, why have you worked on Hyderabad? There was a magic in Hyderabad, the magic that brought all of us together. And that is what you have worked on, and that is what you bring to light, without praising the Nizam, but you are actually praising the work that he did. And this is what we need to remember. So I don't think I have anything more to say unless somebody has a question. But these are just a few things that I wanted to share before the end of the session today. And if you have anything to say, I would be very happy also to listen.
Well, I wanted to say I want to say thank you very much for that moving account of the way that your own experiences and family history, and also the spaces, places, and things and constructed infrastructures in Hyderabad that you've dedicated so much work to, along with your organization, actually help illuminate some of the topics that my book has tried in its own way to scratch upon from a very, very different angle. So I'm greatly indebted for those comments, Anuradha Reddy madam. And honestly, I earlier had planned to kind of say some concluding words, but I don't think that I could actually put it more eloquently than what we've just heard from Madam Reddy, which I think her words help us understand how some of the ideas that one may glimpse in this work are actually embedded in spaces, histories, families, connections, networks that infuse Hyderabad and much of the Deccan. This is not only Hyderabad city. This is not evenly spread, but these are networks that can be traced in some ways through a lot of places in the Deccan and tracking back to much earlier time periods than any single scholar is able to take on all at once.
Could I add one more sentence?
Yeah, please.
It's also interesting to know that within the Samasthan area, no representative of the Nizam could enter without permission of the ruler. in my own case, on my paternal side, my great-grandmother Rani Chilam Janama, when a revenue inspector came to collect the revenue, she said, "This year we have not had good rain. I will send the money as soon as I can." And when he returned insistingly, she tied him to his own cart and sent him back, because she said, "This is my word to the ruler." This is the same lady that was elevated from Rani to Maharani, because she actually conducted the survey of the railway line going from Kachiguda to Manmad. And she accompanied the survey. She bought shares in the Nizam Guaranteed State Railway because she considered it an asset to her state of Sidnapalli to export material from the Samasthan to Bombay and to import from outside to bring into the state and continue to Kachiguda. So there are so many of these layers that people do not know, and that the Nizam allowed, the Nizam was supported by, and he's benefited indirectly, but he then sent it on to the state. I personally have seen the Nizam Usman Ali Khan as a small girl, and I was in shock and surprise when I saw him, because I expected somebody in a brocade sherwani covered in jewelry. And when I saw him, I asked my maternal grandfather, "Is this the Nizam? Is this the Nizam?" Because he was wearing a very simple sherwani and a short kurta pajama. And it was completely different from what I had imagined. So these are some of the things that we should know, that we are actually gifted, that we can live together, that we can speak together, and so many generations later that still we feel this Hyderabadiness, which I feel after 1956 and especially after 1970 has been so disturbed. So when you say, would it have been a Qatar, would it have been a Dubai, I am saying it would have been a Hyderabad. With this, I thank Gayas, all the young people, for asking to be here today. I think I'm the only Hindu present in the whole meeting. And once again, Eric, I would like to say how nice of you to spend your time, energy, researching our background, because this will bring some of this into the future. And I'm very happy to have been here today.
Thank you so much. It was my great pleasure and privilege. And I want to say that these pasts and futures, and in fact, presents and networks of existing connection, living histories, I hope can help us think about how the possibilities of change and development within South Asia might be worked out in ways, and in India and in Hyderabad and in the world, might be thought about and worked out in ways where one's origins and birth, religious community, linguistic community, ethnicity, caste, class, etc., are not determinative of the possibilities in life. And I think that we see some very rich examples of through these histories and personal stories and remembered connections of how we might work towards a world of that kind. Thank you very much for these rich comments. And thanks to all of you for your interest. And I hope that we can all serve as supports for one another in continued research and inquiry into Hyderabad and its historical legacies and presence and futures.
Thanks a lot, both the participants and also our guest and Anuradha ma'am, for giving us an opinion, and also regarding her opinion or her thought, that she reflected her thought. And obviously she's the only Hindu lady in this whole group, because this was an effort to bring out few intricacies about the Muslim and about the history to the Muslim audience itself, because to sensitize them regarding these issues. And another thing is about this was a session, how could we stop the weaponization of history, the construction of enemy in the history, and how the politics are being played in that way. So we try to develop a say in the past that there was a kind of brotherhood that exists, and we have to sustain that brotherhood, because the ongoing weaponization of history is very dangerous, and it may not be the same thing that is today if that continues. At this word, we conclude the session. Thanks a lot, Eric and Anuradha madam. And we are coming up with few other sessions also. We will be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.